This video goes with section 49 of Hansen and Quinn's Greek an Intensive course and covers relative clauses and the relative pronoun you need to form them. Hansen and Quinn has this on pages 142 to 144 and in the appendix on pages 648 and pages 756 and 757. A relative clause is a dependent clause that gives us more information about the noun that it's related to. Let's start by looking at some examples in English. The poet who wrote the book is good. The independent sentence here is in blue. The poet is good. And the rest is the relative clause who wrote the book. Who wrote the book is dependent. It can't be a whole sentence on its own, and is telling you more about the poet. The poet whose book we sent is good is another example. The same main idea, the poet is good, but different information about the poet. Also, with the poet to whom we sent the book is good. The poet is still good, but we've learned a different thing about him with the relative clause to whom we sent the book. And one more, the poet whom we educate is good. Again, the poet is good is the independent clause. Whom we educate, which can't stand on its own, is telling us more about the poet. It's going to get easier to talk about this if we get some jargon. The word that connects the relative clause to the noun it's talking about is the relative pronoun. It relates the information in the clause to that noun, and it stands in for the noun, which is what a pronoun does. The noun it's looking back to, connecting to, relating to, is called the antecedent. You can see that in all of these examples. The poet is the antecedent in every case, and the different forms of the English relative pronoun are all here. As you can already see, the English relative pronoun is one of the few places that English still has case endings. The basic rules you need to know for relative clauses in Greek are that the relative pronoun agrees with the antecedent in number and gender. In the first sentence, the antecedent is the poet, and the who is looking back to the poet. And the second rule is that the relative pronoun has the case it needs in its clause for whatever it's doing in the relative clause. In our first example, who is the English form of the nominative since it is the subject of the relative clause who wrote the book. In the second sentence, whose is looking back to the poet again, but it's the possessive form of the English relative pronoun. In Greek, that would be genitive, since it needs to be possessive in the clause, whose book we sent. It's identifying the poet more by telling us the book belongs to him. That's the poet who is good. Again, the poet is the antecedent in the next sentence, but this whom would be dative in Greek because it's the indirect object in its clause to whom we sent the book. Finally, in the last example, we still have the poet as antecedent, and the whom would be accusative in Greek because it's the direct object in the clause, whom we educate. Okay, I keep talking about what the Greek relative pronoun would do, so it's time for you to meet the Greek relative pronoun. It comes in all the cases except the vocative. It comes in singular and plural, also in dual, but we're not going to worry about that. And it has different forms for the masculine, feminine, and neuter. And here are the forms. Has, he, ha. Who, has, who. Ho, he, ho. Hon, hain, ha. In the plural, hoi, hi, ha. Hone, hone, hone. Hois, heis, hois. And whos, has, ha. The default translation is who or which for the nominative. English doesn't have a different word for singular or plural in the relative clause, but it does have different forms for gender. We use who for masculine and feminine, and which for neuter. The default translation for the genitive, both singular and plural, is whose, or of whom, for masculine or feminine, and of which, for the neuter. In the dative, it is to or for whom, if it's a person, or a masculine or feminine noun that is the antecedent, and to or for which, if it's a neuter that we're referring to. And finally, in the accusative, both singular and plural, the default translation is whom or which for the neuter. Now you know when to use who or whom or whose in English. You only use who if it's the subject of the clause that it's in. And you can see that whose is for the times when it is possessive, and in any other case, all of those object cases, you will use whom. Now, before you get too upset about learning all of these new forms, notice that they are basically the forms of the article, which you already know, with rough breathings instead of towels. Be careful, though, to distinguish between the hey of the relative pronoun, which has an accent, from the hey of the article, which only has a rough breathing. The same goes for the masculine and feminine nominative plurals, which look like the article, but they have accents. The relative pronouns do, whereas the article hoi and hai do not. The masculine nominative singular has two ways to tell the difference from the article. The relative pronoun is hos with an acute, and the article is just ha with no sigma on the end and no accent. Okay, time to do some Greek. Here's our first example sentence from our English examples. And the subject of this sentence, the poet who wrote the book is good, is hopoietes in Greek. Before we get to the Greek relative clause, let's go ahead and put down here the reminders of the rules and the forms of the relative pronoun. So, now we're going to deal with the relative clause. And we're going to look at the first rule, which is to pick the relative pronoun that agrees with the antecedent in number and gender. So the antecedent is poet, and that is masculine and singular, so we're going to need to choose a masculine and singular relative pronoun. The second rule is that the case of the relative pronoun is whatever it needs to be for what it's doing in its own clause. Since who is the subject of wrote, we'll use the nominative masculine singular. So, let's put that into our sentence, hos, and then the rest of the relative clause, and then the end of the main clause, kalos, since this is a nominal sentence. And so the translation into Greek for the poet who wrote the book is good is hopoietes hos to biblion egropsa kalos. Let's try something without the good poet. We sent the book which educated the young men. Here's the relative clause. And now to translate it, let's do the main clause first. Ta biblion epempsamen, for we sent the book. And now for the relative clause. The first rule, the relative pronoun agrees with the antecedent for person and number. The antecedent this time is book, which is neuter and singular, and so we're going to need a neuter and singular relative pronoun. Then the second rule, it needs the case for the clause that it's in, which is the relative clause. Since which is the subject of educated, we'll use the nominative neuter singular. So, Let's put that into our sentence, ha, and then the rest of the relative clause. And now we have ta biblion epempsamen ha tous neanias epaideosen. We sent the book which educated the young men. One more thing to note before I go on to more examples. The word order here is pretty typical of Greek. The verb forms end the clauses, which helps you keep the Greek organized. Also notice that the relative pronoun in Greek doesn't have to be right next to its antecedent, as it usually has to be in English, because the number and gender of the relative pronoun helps us know what the antecedent is. Okay, here's our second example sentence. The subject of the whole sentence is the poet. Here we have that again. Then we look at the first rule and our antecedent, and we know that it has to be a masculine and singular relative pronoun to agree with the gender and number of the antecedent. The second rule has us look at what our relative pronoun is doing in the relative clause. Since whose is the possessive in its clause, we'll use the genitive masculine singular. So we'll put up who, and then the rest of the relative clause, and then the end of the main clause, kalos again. And we get ha poietes hu biblion epempsamen kalos, the poet whose book we sent is good. Now let's try another one. The goddess by whom the war was stopped is good. By whom the war was stopped is the relative clause here. But let's go ahead and put in the subject of the main clause first, he theos. Then we'll look at our first rule, that we need the relative pronoun to agree with its antecedent in gender and number, and our antecedent is goddess, which is feminine and singular. So we need a feminine singular relative pronoun. The second rule is that the relative pronoun needs to be the case that it is for its use in the relative clause. Since by whom is the agent of was stopped, that means we need genitive of agent, and so we'll use the genitive feminine singular. So let's put in that genitive of agent, and we get hupa heis. But now we need to stop for a minute and remember that Greek doesn't like a vowel before another vowel when one ends one word and the another begins the next. So let's elide away that omicron. And then notice that contagious rough breathing there on the relative pronoun. And so what that does is it's going to infect the pi and change it from a pi to a phi. And so correctly now it's hoof heis. Then we'll put in the rest of the relative clause and the rest of the main clause. And we get ha theos, hoof heis, ha polemos epauthe kale, the goddess by whom the war was stopped is good. Let's go to our third example from our collection of English sentences. Here's our subject, good old poet again, and our first rule, and once again, since the antecedent is still that masculine singular poet, we're going to need a masculine and singular relative pronoun. And our second rule makes us look at what case that relative pronoun needs to be for what it's doing in the relative clause. To whom we sent the book means that it's an indirect object, to whom, and so we're going to need the dative masculine singular pronoun. So we write ho, and then the rest of the relative clause, and then we finish off our main clause with the kalos. Ha poietes, ho ta biblion epempsamen kalos. The poet to whom we sent the book is good. That's the poet I'm talking about. It's giving me more information, this relative clause, about the poet. Okay, for variety, let's try another sentence. He wrote about the muse to whom we sacrificed. So here, the relative clause is to whom we sacrificed. And it's going to tell us more about the muse that he wrote about. So let's do the main clause first. Έγραψε περί tes muses. He wrote about the muse. Now for the relative clause, the antecedent is muse, so when we follow the first rule, we pick the relative pronoun that is in the same number and gender as muse, and so that means we're going to choose a feminine and singular relative pronoun. The second rule has us look at how that pronoun is being used in the relative clause. To whom is the indirect object of we sacrificed, and so we will use the dative feminine singular. Let's write that in, he, and then the rest of the relative clause, ethousamen. And so we get έγραψε περί tes muses, he ethousamen. He wrote about the muse to whom we sacrificed. Let's go on to our last good poet sentence. Here's our subject again. And we are now familiar with the fact that the poet is the antecedent, and so that means that our relative pronoun has to be masculine and singular to go with the first rule. This time, since whom is the direct object of we educate, we will use the accusative masculine singular. So let's write that in, hon, and then the rest of the relative clause, and the rest of the main clause. So we get ha poietes hon paideomen kalos. The poet whom we educate is good. Just one more example. The friends whom we harmed were not persuaded. Whom we harmed is the relative clause. Now to translate into Greek. Let's do the main clause first. Hoithiloi uk epistheson. The friends were not persuaded. Then, when we follow the first rule, because the friends are the antecedent, we know that our relative clause is going to have to be masculine and plural. The second rule makes us look at the case that relative pronoun needs to be in its clause. Since whom is the direct object of we harmed, we're going to need the accusative masculine singular. So let's put that in, hus, and then the rest of the relative clause, eblapsamen. The whole sentence then reads, hoithiloi hus eblapsamen uk epistheson. The friends whom we harmed were not persuaded. You should be able to tell by now that relative clauses can be in any tense or voice and relate to their antecedents in innumerable ways. But now you should know how to sort out those relationships and translate in drills and exercises.